If you've gone to talk therapy or done coaching and you've been going for weeks, months, or years, and you just keep talking about the same things, telling the same stories, and whatever you went for, your depressive anxiety symptoms, your trauma symptoms, your relational strategies that don't work, just don't seem to be getting better. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why talk therapy cannot scientifically heal trauma, addiction, or the majority of your mental health symptoms. Hi, my name is John Hawkins Jr. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, certified trauma specialist, and co-founder of Hawkins Counseling Center. This video is going to be a two-part series. In the first video, I'm going to explain to you why talk therapy doesn't heal trauma. In the second video, I'm going to give you some neuroscience-based experiential therapies of what actually works and how you can fully recover from your trauma. So let me start by explaining how trauma develops in the first place. So whenever we go through overwhelming experience in the face of aloneness, helplessness, where we don't have the internal, external resources we need for the event, the brain, to protect itself, will engage in this process called disassociation. So in the more primitive parts of your brain, or what they call your reptilian brain, there's an area called the thalamus, which is kind of like a relay switch for your five senses. So if that energy comes through to the upper brain, it's going to cause cellular death in the brain and nervous system. So it is a survival threat, and then it will, subsequently trigger survival responses. So the thalamus will flood with endogenous or natural internal opiates to block that energy from getting to the upper brain, and will kind of split off in its own fragmented, isolated neural network. Another part of the brain that I talk about ad nauseum in trauma therapy is the amygdala. It just means almond in Latin because it kind of looks like an almond. You have one on each side of the brain. It is the brain's threat detector for our environment. So it is tracking anything from social judgment to physical danger to whatever that may be. If it gets a hint of anything, it will immediately trigger off those survival responses. And in the case of trauma, it becomes very hyper aroused or hyperactive. It also puts in whatever pleasurable memories we have into our emotional memory as well. So it could be either one. Some of those fond feelings you get when you hear a song or smell somebody's cooking, reminds you of your favorite meal your mom or grandma used to make, or a time in your life that you recall with fondness. There's a positive side to it as well. But in either case, what they do is they get stored in what's called implicit memory. So that energy that gets split off, the sensory data, sensation, emotions, smells, sights, sounds, different things like that get too intense, and that dissociative thing splits it off in these isolated neural networks, and then the amygdala puts anything emotional in those implicit networks. So implicit memory is just a felt sense in the body. It has no conscious thought, no imagery, no linear time, no ability to differentiate people, place, or setting, and it also sees false positives just to be safe. It just jumps to conclusions just in case you're in danger. The example I've used a million times is being a runner, running down the street one day, and I jumped, saw this thing out of the corner of my eye, I thought it was a snake. It was a stick. 100% of my time, my brain is going to tell me snake, just to be safe, which is good for snakes, bad for trauma and relationships. It's going to, again, anything from that original event is going to fire off as that's happening and just flood you. And then the other thing that happens when you have any form of trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, unprocessed painful emotions, is you experience what's called compound association. So things start to get neurologically linked. In neuroscience, there's an expression, the neurons that fire together are wired together. So when things happen at the same time, they get neurologically connected. So let's say Monday morning, I've got some unprocessed trauma, and for whatever reason, my amygdala picks up on something while I'm at Starbucks and triggers a panic attack or intrusions or feeling unsafe or heavy. Now Starbucks becomes potentially an association. So now I start avoiding Starbucks. Or Wednesday, I'm at a restaurant with a friend of mine, and now he or she becomes an association because I had a traumatic reaction there. And so I just keep getting re-traumatized. I get this compound association, and then you get what's called comorbid or concurrent other mental health symptoms. So maybe I start to get a phobia about having these events. And so there's the anticipatory anxiety, I might get a traumatic intrusions. Or that could also lead to what we call agoraphobia, where I start to isolate myself from public places, going away from the house, because I'm afraid of having one of these attacks or incidents, which further just keeps hyperactivating the amygdala. And so now I get more and more painted into a corner. Again, maybe I finally go to talk therapy and I start talking about these things, And and it's nice that I get heard and somebody cares, and I get some information about trauma. But then I just keep coming back talking about the same things or the symptoms I experienced this week, or I get some strategies behaviorally or cognitively to try to manage some of these things. But I'm going to explain to you a little bit now why that will never resolve your trauma. So in therapy, there's two narratives that people walk in the door with. So one is the verbal narrative, the content, they're telling me about what happened. The other is the somatic or body emotional narrative. Now for me, this is the much bigger story, and the only story that I can really work with to help the person heal and recover. So part of this stems back from the fact that, again, I was talking about disassociation being one of the most primitive defenses we have down here, what they refer to as the reptilian brain. So animals have a version of this they do too, called tonic immobility. And so if they can't get away from a predator and there's no possibility of escape, they go into this kind of frozen catatonic state, which in some cases can actually be kind of hilarious when you see it on nature videos. And that's, there's different reasons I won't get into on the video of why they do that. But if there's a possibility of escape, they will activate their adrenaline, these networks will kick in, their fight or flight states, and then they'll flee to safety. And then once they're in the safe air, they'll just walk around and tremor and shake for however long to discharge and release all that energy from their body, and they kind of reset their system. Human beings, the reason we don't go through this predominantly is this: we have this big neocortex or thinking brain. It's kind of what makes us human, many would say. That blocks and impedes some of our body's natural ability to discharge this energy and reset ourselves. And so this is another reason, as I'll continue to elaborate on, of why just talking about things becomes the impediment to healing. And there's also, as you're listening to me right now, as I'm speaking right now, we're using large parts of this part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And we're in a network called the executive attention network. So this is a very great network. That's how I was able to organize, produce this video. It's how you get through your, predominantly majority of your day. The problem is most of what we want to access in therapy is in what's called the default mode network, which contains more of the mid regions of the brain, lower regions, and they will not activate simultaneously. So this is another reason we'll just keep talking and keeping this shut down, overthinking, ruminating, wanting to explain every minute detail, which then will flood a person's system more and more, why they don't get any better. The other aspect of this is that disassociation occurs in these low regions of the brain that, again, that include the brainstem. And so these cannot be reorganized, reset through what's called top-down processes, which would be cognition, thinking, then feeling, then body. So it can only be done through a bottom-up process, focusing on the sensory information, the body sensations, what's happening internally, so we can start to activate these networks, control the regulation of the amygdala, and then release and discharge this energy through a process called memory reconsolidation. And so, despite the assertion of many in my field that, through cognitive approaches or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and again, I don't mean to be disparaging, there's people that get a level of value from that. I've never seen anyone heal from trauma using those approaches. At best, they're management. Most of those things are going to be, the most impactful if you don't have deeper seated trauma or issues. Many of these things are common sense stuff you can probably read a book about or just get some guidance and support from a counselor or therapist. But my experience and my clients would tell you all the same, without exception, that those approaches have done basically absolutely nothing to resolve their trauma. And so it's not that you can't heal, it's that part of what's happening is where you're going to seek help and the way you're seeking help is actually blocking you from healing. Another reason that talk therapy can't heal trauma is trauma triggers an emotional dysregulation. So like I mentioned a second ago, these can't be resolved through top-down processes. And then what happens is somebody comes to therapy and they start working on their trauma with a traditional talk therapist. They either talk about it and just keep flooding themselves. The more they see images and the more they start talking about the trauma, it's just lighting up their amygdala. And so they either feel like they want to throw up, or they're shaken, or they can talk about it in a dysregulated way on the other end of the scale, which is detached, numb, dissociated. And so they can come to therapy for years and they can talk and feel like, well, I feel better. It's because they don't feel anything. They're just completely dissociated. And so the more they talk, the more they just stay in one of these two areas. Or if you're on this side of it, you start dreading coming to therapy because I've got to activate all this panic and anxiety. And again, then I get all this anticipatory anxiety and phobia of coming to therapy. Now coming to therapy becomes traumatic. So one of the reasons for that is trauma disrupts communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The amygdala becomes dominant, takes over, just floods you, shuts down aspects of the prefrontal cortex. And then all those, cognitive approaches like tell yourself I'm safe or that I'm worthy, your body just laughs out because the body's like, I don't feel safe or I don't feel worthy. You can tell me whatever you want, but you can't trick me because I'm still stuck back at 8 years old getting abused. And so it's not even gonna listen to those if I can even think of those at all because my thinking brain will be so shut down that moment. So one of the things research has shown us is that an area of the brain called the insula or insular cortex it does a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is it makes us aware of what we're feeling in our body in space, some of our inner world, what's called interoception, an inward focus, which actually activates different networks than if you're focused out here. So studies show that people with more active insula and different like cell volume, larger insulas are more resilient, are less likely to get PTSD, can manage their emotions more effectively. So we really want to start to activate this part of the brain by focusing on body sensations, what is happening, how the energy is moving, areas that might feel tension or relief or lightness. One of the things studies have shown is that the insula can actually start to downregulate all that hot activity in the amygdala, where the prefrontal cortex will tend to amp it up. And so again, here's an area where talking starts to create more problems than healing, but starting to focus on this. And I know that can be challenging for some of you because in trauma, I leave the body. The body's bad, it's overwhelmed, it's flooded, and so I need to get out of the body, dissociate from the body, so I may not have body awareness. And again, you could be one of those individuals that comes to talk therapy and I don't even realize how disconnected from my body I am. So I just talk and fill out worksheets and get this great information from this caring therapist, and all those things may be true, but none of my symptoms are truly going anywhere. And this is another one of the reasons why. Another challenge in trauma is the area of our brain called the hippocampus, which is where our conscious or explicit memories are stored, is disrupted by trauma because the intensity of all this sensory information coming, and the hippocampus isn't able to consolidate and imprint those memories effectively. So what we know conclusively now is that these verbal narratives don't allow the energy that's kind of stored in all these like dissociative neural networks to be integrated and imprinted effectively in the hippocampus. The one value I would say in these kind of situations is the first time you tell the verbal narrative. So maybe it's been something that you've carried for a long time since childhood, and there's a tremendous amount of shame, whether it was sexual abuse, physical abuse, really shaming things that were done to me, things I'm embarrassed about. And so disclosing that to a supportive, safe other person does have value, I would say, in that first round of work. But after that, now it just starts to become this looping thing where you're talking in circles, or what I refer to in therapy as throwing words in the air. So then you're spending all this money and time just to come in and kind of throw words in the room and leave. So I don't want you to feel like that wasn't a big deal and didn't take a lot of courage to share that story for the first time, but now we want to get into the body and the emotional narrative. So using that body emotional narrative, what we want to do is focus on the felt sense with, this is what creates that neuroplasticity. This is how we access those implicit networks, and start using sensation and the insula to modulate them, the support between the therapist to help you co-regulate what you can't regulate on your own until we can start to clear some of this out. So again, reiterating, trauma is often stored in nonverbal parts of the brain. So the verbal narrative can't access the broader regions of the brain to get access to these neural imprints and reintegrate them and clear that energy from the body. So now, in closing part one of this video series, what I want to do is give you 3 stories from clients I've been given permission to share. One is going to explain the single incident trauma and why talk therapy doesn't work and how experiential therapies work. A single incident trauma with kind of prolonged aspects to it that went on for weeks or months. And then complex PTSD, which is more relational during my brain development, let's say 16 down to birth, and how the different types of therapies can be, so much more effective in healing trauma. So the first one comes from a woman that I work with actually just one time. She was in a car accident and developed PTSD as a result. Now, anytime she would try to drive her car, she would get a panic attack. So she went and saw a therapist for 6 months doing traditional talk therapy. Her therapist, who I know is a kind person, was trying to help my client. And, she tried all these different approaches. Finally, he said, okay, why don't I refer you to somebody else who does more specialized trauma work? So the woman came to me, and I just asked her to tell me a little about the incident because I wanted to see how regulated she was. Did she get panicky? Did she go numb? So she talked about the incident with connection, didn't get overwhelmed. I mean, she had like 6 months worth of experience of talking about it, so she was pretty good at sharing it, but she knew something was missing. So at that time, I did a therapy called EMDR, which is a well-known trauma therapy. We did about 25 minutes of that therapy. She left driving, drove her friend who had brought her, never needed to come back, with the exception that she came back 3 times to ask me for business cards for people she knew. So that is the power of experiential therapies, and that single incident trauma, 25 minutes versus 6 months of getting nowhere. The second comes from a client I had who was struggling with substance use after being at 9/11. He was a contractor and was, on the scene helping clear the debris, and witnessed, dead bodies, body parts, just the massive destruction of the city he'd grown up in his whole life. Very emotional for him, and as a result, he had developed alcoholism and use of Xanax as a way to regulate his PTSD. He'd been through all kinds of therapy, support groups, and just believed at this point the best he could ever experience would be managing these symptoms. So again, we did some EMDR and an evolution of EMDR called brain spotting, where him and I worked through probably in 2 to 3 sessions, if I recall, and fully resolved that. That last session, he just broke down crying, and he said, I just can't impress you like what had just happened and what you did for me. I was certain I was just gonna have to live with this the rest of my life. And he came to full acceptance of what happened, a sense of peace, and even was able to bring some positive things of inner resiliencies out of this horrible tragedy. The third and the last example was a young man I worked with who had a lot of different issues with anger and rage and substance use. And so as him and I started working together, what I discovered was he'd gone through years of physical abuse as a child, witnessed severe domestic violence of his mother, and developed, again, aggressive behavior, substance use, all these things, trying to control his rage and behavior. And so him and I worked for probably somewhere between 9 and 12 months. He had complex PTSD that I referred to earlier. So it's a much broader range of issues and impact because it's happening during our brain development. But even in that case, within 9 to 12 months, we were able to work through his substance use. He got sober. He was able to not feel these feelings of anger and rage that would come up all the time for him, and completely changed his life, went back to school, got a degree, and developed a career. Last I heard, he had a meaningful relationship. So these are examples of, again, a single incident, kind of a single extended incident, and then complex PTSD. So in the second video, I'm gonna go from why talk therapy doesn't work to what does work, and I'm gonna show you neuroscience-based trauma therapies that we're fortunate to have learned and discovered and continue to evolve and extend so we can get more and more proficient in helping people heal from their traumas. So if you enjoyed this video, if you made it this far, I thank you. If you benefited from it, I'm happy. That's our whole point in putting these videos out. If you feel somebody you care about could benefit from it, please forward it. If you'd like more information about this topic, or like to speak to my wife and I, Bissan, anytime, you can go to hawkinscounselingcenter.com, and we'll see you in the next video.